Chapter 13 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 13. From Lowland to Highland. One morning Paul and Barnabas with John Mark walked down to the snug harbour that lay below the city of Paphos. In the circle made by the embracing arms of the stone breakwaters some little ships rocked on the water. The deck of one of them was busy with preparations for sailing. The three travellers went aboard, the crew weighed anchor, and the boat slipped out through the harbour mouth into the open sea. Skirting the treacherous ledge of rock which, as the sailors knew, lay just under the shining surface of the sea outside the harbour, they laid a course to the northwest. The boat slipped westward at first, bearing north round the curve of the coast as the sun lifted astern above Mount Olympus. When they sailed months before to Cyprus from Seleucia, they saw away to the north the white ridge of the Taurus range behind the Cilician plain on which Paul was born. For at that time the snows were not melted and the air was clear. But now full summer had come, the snows above were melted, and the air had the haze of heat in it. All day long the ship sailed, and through the night. She was bound for Perga on the coast of Pamphylia, farther westward than Cilicia. If the breeze was with her, she would at dawn make the Gulf of Attalia, which swept out to sea in two great arms of hills protecting a plain. As the mists of morning lifted, Paul would see, far ahead beyond the plain, the grey heights of the Taurus. In the centre of the bay the sea was coloured with the running waters of a river, the Cestrus. The river, carefully banked with stone and with wood balks, would remind Paul of his well-beloved Cydnus. For Perga was like Tarsus, in that it lay some miles up from the actual mouth of the river. The ship's oars were swung out, and dipped and flashed as the crew pulled the vessel upstream. It took over an hour's rowing to bring them up to the harbour of Perga, where the city lay in the blazing sun sheltered between the forest-covered hills, with the damp air rising from her river. Even the stadium and the theatre would be deserted, for Paul and his companions had come at the time of year when the people of Perga moved out from the city up into their suburb among the hills. He remembered how in the blazing summer time they used to do the same when he was a boy at Tarsus. The Pergans loved their wooded hills, and out behind the city they had built a lovely temple to Diana, the huntress of the gods, with her bow and quiver of arrows. Paul came fresh from the open sea into the moist heat of the Pamphylian coast. As day wore on to evening a dank mist rose. A dull purple, poisonous haze spread stealthily over the low coastland as the horizon cut the sun's rim. The air was filled with the wearisome singing of mosquitoes and the hum of flies. Frogs kept up an unceasing chorus in the marshes. The sultry heat gave place to a miasma which sent its damp chill even through Paul's cloak. The towering Taurus mountains above the plain kept away, like a rampart, the fresh, clean invading breezes of the north. The foul malaria of the marshes, creeping along the coastline like unclean ghosts, struck Paul. Nowhere on the Mediterranean coast is the pestilence of fever so dreaded as on this spot. And Paul was, it seems, smitten with fever here at Perga. What was he to do? To stay there on that stricken Pamphylian plain was to leave his body a prey to the shivering agonies of fever without any advantage, for he could do no work there. Should he go back? The thought would find no anchorage in the minds of men of the temper of Paul and Barnabas. But ahead of them lay the steep mountain ascents, and beyond their ridge, the high, dry, bracing air of the great plateau with its Roman cities, and the great Roman highway that ran from east to west. Paul, in Cyprus, had begun to win the Roman power when he convinced Sergius Paulus. Why not go further with the campaign? They held a consultation and decided to press forward, though John Mark shrank from the adventure, for he turned back and sailed home again to Syria. Turning their backs on the sea, Paul and Barnabas breasted the foothills, where the almond trees had already dropped their blossom in a snowstorm of white petals. Paul would ride on an ass, and from time to time try to walk, feebly at first, and often needing to rest on a boulder by a mountain pool where the gentle, brown water waited to refresh him. But as he felt the rock under his feet and drew the keener air of the hills among the pines, new life came with each deep breath. His step was more certain and firm, his eye quickened. They climbed by the sides of ravines, where tumbling waters splashed down in torrents toward the great sea, whose blue grew dimmer in the distance each time they rested to look back. They had left the peril of fever, but a new danger was all about them — the peril of robbers. Many fierce brigands hid among the grim, grey fastnesses of these Pisidian highlands in the rocky caverns under the pines. These bronzed robbers ambushed themselves, and then leapt down the sides of the ravine like wild goats. They sprang out and held up the caravans of merchandise that toiled up this path to the cities on the upper plains. Once out among the upper Pisidian hills, with the ridge of the Taurus behind them, all would be well with Paul and Barnabas, for the Romans had just made a new road, of which they were so proud that they called it the Royal Road. Its freshly paved length ran from Pisidian Antioch eastward and southward, joining up with the Roman colony of Lystra, on purpose to make it easy to send soldiers along to put down these robbers. The two travellers were, however, not yet out upon this open land, and the steep defiles of the Taurus, where only a mule track ran, were still the happy hunting ground of the brigands. Paul himself tells us, just in a sentence, how he was " in peril of robbers." This journey from Perga up the mountainside through the Pisidian country to Antioch is one where Paul may well have been seized and robbed by brigands, springing out from behind the boulders of a hillside or out from the cleft of a tiny stream. At last Paul and Barnabas crested the Taurus ridge itself and looked down on the rolling plains spread before them. Behind them the steep mountains ran down southward 5,000 feet to the ocean from which they had climbed, but in front the hills only dropped less than 1,000 feet to the wonderful shining tableland. Paul and Barnabas worked northward, and crossed the purple and brown foothills of the Taurus. At last they came in sight of a great aqueduct, whose arches ran across the plain like a string of giant camels turned to stone by magic as they carried water across the land. The aqueduct ran to a beautiful city set on the sides of a rocky hill. On the shoulder of the hill was a temple cut in the living rock, and before it a portico of marble with carvings of bulls' heads hung with garlands. But, away from the temple, there was a smaller, plainer building with no carving on it, yet strong in its simplicity. It was here and not to the temple that Paul and Barnabas went. It was the meeting house of the Jews of Antioch. Having entered, Paul and Barnabas sat down quietly to join in the Sabbath worship. The lessons were read from the law of Moses and from one of the prophets. The chief men in the synagogue saw, from the dress and the ways of the two strangers, that these travellers were Hebrews like themselves. They would, for instance, have over their heads the wrap which all the Jews put on when entering the synagogue. So they said to them, "You men, and, as we see, brother Jews, if you have any word to encourage the people here, say on." Barnabas was not so good a speaker as Paul, so Paul stood up and said, with a sweep of his arm, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, give ear." He used this double form of address on purpose, because, beside the real Jews, the men of Israel, there were many Greeks who found in the worship of Jehovah something great and real, a dignity and clean strength that gripped them more than the temple worship of gods of marble. So these Greeks he spoke to as those who fear God. The boys in the synagogue would look at Paul at first because he was something new and strange. But soon their eyes were glued to him, partly by that strange fascination which a man always exercises who is ready to meet any adventure or peril to reach a high end, and partly because he began to tell again the heroic story that these Jewish boys knew so well. He pictured the great trek from Egypt across the desolate wilderness over Jordan to the freedom of the plain of Jericho and of the hills about Jerusalem. They saw again, through Paul's eyes, the boy Samuel growing up to be their wise old ruler, and then the coming of the giant king Saul and the shepherd David on the throne. He showed how all this was leading up to something, from the tents in the desert to the city in the hills, from the simple rule of Samuel to the greater rule needed by a nation among nations, the rule of kings. It was leading to what? The coming, how all of them were waiting for the greatest king to come. Then suddenly Paul sprang it upon them, the good news that would take away their breath. God had actually already sent his forerunner, the blazing forth-teller, John the Baptist, and now the Messiah of God himself, Jesus the Christ, had come. "The Jews in Jerusalem," Paul went on, "though they could not find him guilty of any crime, begged Pilate to have him put to death. They hanged him on the gibbet cross and buried him. But God raised him from the dead, and many of his companions, who had walked up to Jerusalem with him from Galilee, saw him alive and are witnesses to the people that this is true. So now we have come here to tell you the glad news, that the promise God made to our fathers he has carried out for us, their children." Some of the Jews, probably the officials of the synagogue sitting just in front of where Paul was speaking, evidently wagged their heads and glowered at him, murmuring to one another that nobody who hung on the accursed death tree could be a son of God. For turning swiftly to them at the end of his speech, Paul said, "Take care then, for fear that the old saying may be true of you. Look, you contemptuous folk, wonder at this and perish. For in your days I do a deed you will never believe, not though one were to explain it to you." There was a bustle of excitement when Paul had finished. The people were all agog, some thinking what Paul said might really be true, others practically convinced that he and Barnabas were nothing but a pair of travelling impostors. As the two went out of the door, a number of people who thought the story of Jesus was true came clustering round them, asking a great many questions. Some of these people were Jews, others were Greeks and Romans, on whose pagan life disgust and secret loathing fell, deep weariness and sated lust made human life a hell. These Greeks and Romans had heard the Jews talking of the one holy, unseen, eternal God, the Spirit who created all things, and they felt that they could worship him, as they never could really bow down to their ill-tempered, evil-living gods. So they had attached themselves to the worship of the Jews and had accepted circumcision. "Repeat it all next Sabbath," said the people, and Paul promised that he would do so. As the elder boys went home from the synagogue and sat down to food at home, they would hear their fathers discussing this astonishing new teaching. On the next day, in the market-place, among the groups chattering in the bazaar, the one centre of conversation was the words of these strange new visitors. So that on the following Sabbath, when Paul and Barnabas went to synagogue, they found themselves faced by a sea of men, Jews, Greeks and Romans, and at the doorway a mass of the people who did not belong to their worship, but had come together out of curiosity to hear this new strange story. Meanwhile the Jews, who had shown on the previous Sabbath that they did not believe what Paul said, were getting angry with these vagrant preachers who had set all the people by the ears. They were jealous, too, that so many people had come together to hear Paul. When he began to speak they interrupted, contradicting him and calling him names there in the synagogue. But the more they attacked him, the more fearlessly did Paul and Barnabas argue and maintain with all their power that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the Christ of God. At last the two comrades saw that the narrower Jews were hopelessly bigoted against them, so they stood up and said, The word of God had to be spoken to you Jews in the first instance. But as you push it aside and judge that you yourselves are not worthy of eternal life, well," and they pointed to the crowd of faces at the back and in the doorway, " here, we turn to the nations." The outside people were delighted to hear this. When the synagogue service broke up they crowded round to hear more. And in the marketplace, when the people came in from the country round, they were told of the wonderful news that the Creator of all the world had come into human life and shown His love in Jesus the Christ. When they went back home to their country villages among the hills they talked about the new doctrine. The next market day they would ask more about it, and maybe gather round Paul and Barnabas to hear what they had to say. Many of them learned to believe, and in many places round about little bands of Christian people began to grow into being. All the while, however, the angry Jews were working secretly. They went to the women who worshipped in their synagogue who were married to Roman officials of high rank, and they got them to urge their husbands to turn these tramp fellows out of the city, where they were upsetting everybody. So one day they began to hustle Paul and Barnabas out of the city. Down the street and out through the gate they rushed the two. When they were out in the open, Paul and Barnabas stopped and undid their sandals, took them off and shook out the dust. It was their declaration of protest, as every Jew who watched them doing it knew quite well, against the treatment of the Antiochenes. They were out on the open road again, with the white stones of the Roman road under their feet and the blue sky overhead. John Mark, they remembered, had gone back in safety to his quiet home in Palestine. Saul and Barnabas, despised and rejected, amid contumely and derision, went hooted and homeless out onto the road of adventure for the King. End of chapter 13.